Okay, great. So, good afternoon, good morning, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the third edition of our EU-India Relations Policy Brief series, which we are delighted to co-host with the Council for Strategic and Defense Research in Delhi. My name is Jochen Luckscheiter. I'm the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation New Delhi office. The policy brief we are launching today focuses on climate action and the green economy, an area that could well become one of the defining features of the EU-India partnership. However, the question is whether both sides can move from ambition to joint action. Frameworks for cooperation already exist. We have, for example, the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership, the Trade and Technology Council, and the Connectivity Partnership, all of which touch on aspects of the green transition in one way or the other. Yet, as in other areas of the EU-India relationship, commitments often outpace implementation, raising questions about how to turn dialogue into joint delivery and action. With this in mind, today's discussion will look at how this cooperation can align more closely with India's priorities, ranging from, for example, scaling e-mobility to renewable energy manufacturing, and how it can also respond to Europe's needs for a resilient supply chain, among other things. The larger question is whether such an alliance can help bridge the trust deficit that continues to mark the North-South debates on climate action, maybe even more so following the presentation or the speech by Donald Trump yesterday at the General Assembly, where he framed the climate debate as one of the largest cons ever. What makes our India-Europe policy series distinctive is that each policy paper is co-authored by an Indian and a European-focused expert, and so is this one that we will be discussing here today. This not only enriches the analysis with diverse perspectives, but also reflects the kind of collaboration that we believe should define the EU-India relationship. At a time when both sides are searching for greater policy alignment, such cross-regional dialogue, I believe, is essential. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the two authors for putting together the policy brief, and of course also to our moderator and other speakers of the session here today. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Thank you. Over to you, Devika.
Hi, thank you, Jochen. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Devika, and I work at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. And I just want to welcome you all on behalf of CSDR. Jochen and I are mixing things up a little today, and he's joining from New Delhi, and I'm joining from Berlin. Anyway, just a brief introduction of CSDR today. CSDR is a New Delhi-based think tank, and we combine global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in rigorous research and experiential knowledge. And expertise covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, defense, geoeconomics, climate change, and tech policy, to name some, with regional expertise in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. So we are delighted to be hosting this webinar with HPS today as part of our collaborative policy brief series titled India-Europe Relations, Advancing Policy Alignment. Today, we are formally launching our third report of this series, Climate Action and Green Economy Opportunities in the EU-India Strategic Partnership, which has been authored by our experts here, Professor Jesse Scott, Shua Raha, and also Mr. Krishnaveer Vora. Attendees can soon find the formal report, which will be pinged in the chat. So to quickly kick things off, let me introduce our speakers. We have our moderator, Sangeet Selvaraju, who's a policy fellow for sustainable finance, India and ASEAN at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Thank you for joining us today, Sangeet. We have Professor Jesse Scott, who's a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Delhi, and adjunct faculty at the Hertie School, Berlin. Welcome, Professor Scott. We have Shua Raha, who's lead for the International Cooperation Program at the Council for Energy, Environment and Water. Welcome, Shua. We are also joined by Ms. Caroline Idiri today, who's the head of unit bilateral relations for the Director General for Climate Action in the European Commission. I think she's running a little late today. Oh, no, she's here. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Caroline. We look forward to your thoughts today. So that's our expert panel. Some quick housekeeping notes. I request our panelists to keep their opening remarks to 5 to 7 minutes and post the opening session and the moderated discussion. We will open the floor for questions from our attendees. So please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. That's all from me. I will now hand over the proceedings to Sangeet. Over to you.
Thank you, Devika, and thank you, Jochen. Can you hear me well? Yeah, super. Thanks to the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and CSDR to be able to organize this joint EU-India webinar series. It's a topic that's an area of research that has been grossly under-researched, particularly on the EU and India. So I think it's good to see traction on this vital area, and this policy brief being one among the contributions for that. So, as Devika said, my name is Sangeet Selvaraju, and we are sitting here today in Delhi. Sorry, Caroline, you can't join us in person, but we will assume you're having FOMO, because the action is all possibly in India, and we will find out later today in the discussion. So I'll give some framing comments on what the EU-India partnership has been historically, and maybe what the potential is, and what's different about climate in that context. And then we'll turn it over to our distinguished co-authors that are here with us today, and then get Caroline's comments after that. So if we just take a macro view of where we are and of these two economies, we've got about 1.4 billion people in India, about 400 billion in the EU, $4 trillion economy in India, about a $20 trillion economy at the EU. So jointly, something like a 24, 25 trillion economies, and about 2 billion people. Now that's not new. The numbers have changed a bit, but the size and opportunity of that has existed for a long period of time. And as many who are in this room or who are listening will know, partnerships have been attempted for decades now at the EU-India level. Unfortunately, to not much significant effect. Part of that has been there have been many sticking points in other sectors that have been challenging for the EU-India relationship. Part of that is communication, part of that is different starting points of where we have been. What is potentially different in the climate context, and what's different now? And that's what makes this particular policy series and this policy brief important. Is I think both of these regions have kind of acknowledged that you can't cheat physics, and there's been an acknowledgement, a fundamental acknowledgement of action on climate on both parts. The EU has kind of shown climate leadership globally, consistently, for a long period of time, both through the member states, but also at the EU level. India, similarly, given a different starting point of where they are in terms of development and common but differentiated, accounting for common but differentiated responsibilities, has also shown extraordinary progress in renewables installations and other areas in terms of taking the climate challenge seriously. The impacts of climate change are being felt in both places already. The continent that has already gotten the hottest in the world in terms of increased temperature has been the EU. India is the sixth most climate impacted country in the world. Now, not all weather events and not all new meteorological changes can be directly associated to climate change, but the increased intensity and the unpredictability of events can be. And so from floods in Valencia in Germany, which causing billions of euros of damage in lives, to changing crop patterns in India, to heat stress and worker deaths. These climate impacts, it's not a distant thing anymore. It's not that the climate models are saying, oh, this is going to be impacts that you feel in the future and the costs are going to be felt. These costs are being felt now, and these costs are being felt across borders. And so I think there is a fundamental acknowledgement of that in the polity in both of these regions. And that brings us to why maybe climate could be different in terms of an area of cooperation for these regions. As I said, the EU has shown great ambition. It has been responsible, I would say, for first energy revolution in the solar, in creating the mass demand for solar, led by Germany and other markets. And similarly for other technology and also interesting financial regulations for incentivizing climate investments. EU has seen itself as a regulatory power, and for a long time saw its role as having the Brussels effect. The effect that a large market like the EU, by having domestic regulations, would incentivize other regions of the world to comply with similar or build interoperable regulations to be able to access the European market. That has led to some positive effects, but also to a lot of negative consequences and perception in other parts of the world, namely one being CBAM, which I'm sure we'll touch on from our panelists, so I will leave it for them to take up. On the other hand, India has acknowledged that it needs to take greater leadership in climate action, but has said, given that its limited capital base in terms of financial resources and its later start in it's still being a lower middle income country, would require support in both technology and finance and investment. So given that, and given that both of these regions will be vital for net zero for anybody, really, and for climate action, this is an area that has potential for cooperation. So before I turn over to my esteemed colleagues, I have kind of an anecdote maybe some of the Indian colleagues will get, but hopefully some of the European ones will be familiar with as well. So arranged marriages are something that's quite common in India, and something that some of the European colleagues might have at least heard of through Bollywood. So this, in my view, has been an arranged marriage that's been waiting to happen for maybe 20 years. Now it's up to the folks in this room, the track 2ers, the track 1.5ers, the academics, the bureaucrats on both sides, to be able to arrange this marriage to happen. So with that, I will turn over to Shubha with maybe one starting prompt, and maybe you can speak to this. So we're talking about these high-level cooperations. In your brief, you've outlined some areas for potential collaboration, hinted at some sectors of where there could be real win-wins for the EU and India. What is India's ask of the EU in terms of EU-India climate partnership? If that's something that and if you could touch on in your opening comments, that would be really helpful. Over to you, Shubha.
Thank you so much, Sangeet. And before I start, a very warm welcome to Jesse and Sangeet at CEW. I'm happy we can do this in the room because that's so cool. And I also want to tell everybody who's listening that working with Jesse I worked with her before, but this was revelatory because she really cuts to the bone. She gets to the matter, and she says that this is how we're going to approach this, which has been great because a lot of it gets lost in academic speak, and the point is usually not reached. So to start with, I just want to say a little bit about the difference between a partnership and what's going to be headline in a couple of months, the trade agreement. And everyone, whether it comes through or not, there's going to be a lot of analysis at the trade level, which involves very micro and fine discussions on HSN codes and trade and everything. And it's difficult to get a big win over there, especially in the time that we have and the pace that we're trying to get to it. So overall focus needs to stay on building a partnership, which is a more time consuming, more relationship heavy word. It has more connotations than products and services. It has ideological moorings in that. It has long-term goals involved in that. It has people-to-people contact culture. Lots of things come in which are not traditionally just a supply chain issue. And so I would expect that the conversations, and this is where I think the global polity that you mentioned comes in, that we have big elephants in this room, right? We have the US, we've heard yesterday, but we've been hearing a lot over time. We have China, the China plus one conversation with India. We have Russia, the Russian oil, etc., that conversation. But even if we keep these aside, EU India itself has not really exploited its own potential bilaterally between them. We've had starts and stops, we've had some successes. I would say a lot of this success has been bilaterally with EU member countries. For example, the International Solar Alliance, which India and France co-founded, which now has 120 members, has done fairly good work over the decade. We also have the Germans coming on the green energy corridor, which really helped India scale up its renewable energy capacity. But now it's time to go big. And the thing that you mentioned, Sangeet, that on the time scale, our developmental journeys are asymmetrical. It's not happening at the same time. But the consequences of the climate risk, etc., is happening at the same time. So the disproportion that we see in the effort and resources required by India, which also has a particular challenge of being the most populous country, we're also a very large democracy, so we cannot reach by top-down mandates. We have to build consensus ground up. So over here is where we need to align expectations. And this expectation is not a technical expectation. It's not a technical council that can solve this. 2-3 areas where I see, and this is what Jesse and I spoke of, and I must also give a shout out to Krishna Vora who helped put it together, our document. We said that why don't we look beyond this complicated topics and see if there are some easy wins that also make headlines. And one area that I will touch upon and go into deep later on, I think India's DPI story is huge. So DPI into delivery of services and products of the clean energy equation becomes huge. It's also a network technological entity, so it has other players come in. It's not just a clean conversation. It's got a lot of, it's got the AI conversation, it's got semiconductors, it's got heavy industry, it's got a lot of components to it.
DPI being digital public infrastructure.
Yeah.
For our European colleagues.
Yes, yeah, because I take it for granted that everybody knows what it is. A second area where we are right now feeling slightly warm here is heating for Europe, cooling for India, cooling for Asia. It's a huge, huge GDP related area, which I think transcends again technology. It's a human issue. It can lead to severe humanitarian crisis, migrations, all sorts of things. Again, here is somewhere where technology, finance, and a broader conversation of people comes in, where I think India can collaborate. A third thing, and this is an interesting thing when Jesse had spoken it, we need to go deeper into this, is how EU's experience with managing historical cities, which already have built infrastructure, which already have people there for hundreds or thousands of years. How do you modernize this for the future? What is the technology of it? Or how do you redesign people's behavior, mobility systems, how they eat, how they stay? These are the broad conversations where I think a 20-25-year relationship going up to India's vision for development 2047 is the Viksit Bharat Developed India target. We have a fair bit of runway to do it right and to do it readily. So I will pass it on to see if you agree with some of these things.
Thanks, Shiva.
Yeah.
I think you've kind of highlighted and touched on what the variety of climate-related pieces could be, not just the typical mitigation or technology-specific adaptation pieces, but looking at lessons in urban planning. I think widening the remit of what it is that you could think of as kind of low-hanging fruit, maybe. So, Jesse, over to you. Again, prompt from me would be, I think there has not been enough communication, right? And I think therefore that has resulted in miscommunication or misunderstanding. So what is it that the Europeans would really like from India in this partnership?
I just want to come to that via an opening perspective, because I think that's the essence of the question. But let me take your prompt about the arranged marriage. I think we would all be honest here to say this is not a natural love match. Not because there cannot be love, but because there hasn't been love at first sight.
Yes.
That's fine. So very good marriages can emerge without love at first sight. It's a historic opportunity between Europe, particularly the European Union, and India at the moment. At a historic moment in climate change, 10 years after the Paris Agreement, and as you were saying, living with climate impacts, which anybody who's paying attention sees escalating. A historic moment in clean technologies, particularly in the energy sector, my field, your field, where there is a fear of missing out. And we can put the label China on that. It's a little broader than just China, but there is a question about who wishes to be a front leader here and the benefits of it. A historic moment in geopolitics, which is what is indeed encouraging this arranged marriage discussion.
Yes.
Within that historic moment, I think there are bilateral win-wins for Europe and India, India and Europe. That's why I'm sitting in Delhi today. That's why I decided this is the place to be for both our sakes. And also, if we can get this right between Europe and India, there are historic opportunities for a global template, which could be repeated, let us hope, for the United States sometime, but certainly between Europe and other developing economy, emerging market partners. That's the kind of leadership that the world is looking to India for. Second brief comment. Yes, President Trump. If it's President Trump versus Earth system physics, I know who I'm betting on. And to expand on your point about the physics doesn't negotiate with human beings. It doesn't listen, it doesn't delay. So we have to negotiate with one another. That's where our options and flexibilities lie. So, as you said, Shubha, really where you and I are coming from, and also I think very much where HBS and CSDR are coming from, and indeed the European Commission colleagues, hi Caroline, is let's get pragmatic. What can we agree to do? We have some building blocks from, let's call it 30 years of dialogues. Some of those are more driven from one side or the other side, but I think there are areas where there are common interests, and there are areas where there are perhaps asymmetries that can fit together rather well. And we've sketched some of those in this short paper, and there's so much more in-depth work coming from that direction. How do we link those building blocks between, if I dare say, the technical working level to the very high level process we now have around summit, trade negotiations, and beyond the trade negotiations, which are now very tight and very narrow, to a future investment protection agreement, which is moving beyond goods to all the other things that are part of a trading relationship. I think the opening remark about trust was absolutely on the nail. And in the very 1.5 track meetings, so I will not name names, that I've been having here, it becomes increasingly clear to me that both sides are somewhat on the defensive. India is on the defensive for very good reasons to do with the challenges and fragilities of a vast population in a developing economy. Let me call that the defensiveness of a rising economy. Europe is also somewhat on the defensive. You only have to engage with our domestic debate on competitiveness, and that is coming from a different direction. That's the direction of a mature economy, which, at least as a proportion of the world, is playing a smaller role than it did 30, 40 years ago. So we are both defensive, but for slightly different reasons. There's also some gaps in mutual knowledge. Sangeet, you mentioned there's not enough research. Frankly, there's not enough staff capacity, at least in the European government end. I do not find enough people sitting on the India desk. Tons of people working on China, tons working on relations with the States. perhaps not proportionate numbers working on the relationship with India. That could change fast, and I'm hopeful it will. We don't really fully understand one another's institutions, although we have some historic characteristics in common. We need to understand one another's domestic constraints in relation to stakeholders. Let me name here the steel sector, and this is certainly one of the places where it comes up. Although I want to be clear, I think CBAM is a relatively small problem compared to the scale of the opportunity if we can get the investment relationship right. So let's keep our eye on the prizes here. 3 quick summary messages. First, Europe, it's an astounding experience being in India and encountering digital public infrastructure. And I go back to Europe, and we are antediluvian. And the things that DPI can do beyond just payment systems, when we think about the measurement of embedded emissions, when we think about taxonomies, all of the measurement information gathering type tasks that are part of the green transition, I'm looking to India and India's digital talent there. Point. Really, I would encourage my Indian friends and colleagues to think more of this discussion with the European Union as a whole, and with Brussels, and with the Commission. Now, that's not just because trade sits with the Commission in Brussels, it's also because we make actually a very steady partner. In relation to a single country with a leader who changes at elections, the partnership can change with the electoral cycle. That's not the nature of the European Union as a bloc. We reach many internal consensuses. We tend to stick to those internally. What India can agree with Europe today will remain true in half a decade and a decade. It can deepen and broaden, but it will not zigzag and change direction and cause strange U-turns. And perhaps steady partnerships are something we should all be desiring in this disruptive, confusing, and challenging world. Last point is mutual. The historic starting points of the economy, of the energy system are quite different. But let's remember we're both aiming for the same destination. Efficiency first, renewables, through renewables, an electricity-based system, some indirect electrification, ultimately some carbon removal. The destination, fundamental toolkit, is the same for everybody. So yes, there are difficult conversations about the historic past. Yes, there are some conversations around our mutual areas of defensiveness, but actually we're going for the same prize. We're going for the same landing points, and those are quite near term on some of the technologies and opportunities that we try to outline in this paper. Sandy, back to you.
Super. Thanks, Jesse. I think there's before I bring in our colleague online, Caroline, and maybe she can tell us how many people are sitting on the India desk in her team, just to see, to look at what Jesse has said. I think one of the things that really stands out from what you've said on your 3 summary points, I think the second one is there is this offensive defensive nature and the starting point, not just historically, but of where we are as we approach each other. I see the Europeans look at India as the world's 4th largest economy, and therefore treat it as such, as they should. However, it is also a lower middle income per capita economy at the very same time, with a 2,500-3,000 GDP per capita. It is both of those things, and in that lies the complexity of how domestic change would have to happen and compromises would have to be had. Similarly, Indians see the Europeans as, well, amongst the world's richest, incredible prosperity, increased ambition on climate, but are not seeing there is an existential crisis in Europe, not just from defense and security, but of industry. As the Draghi report lays out very clearly, it is a call to action. It is also looking at its climate ambitions in that light, which is in a moment of crisis. So it must acknowledge both of these recent developments, right, in a way in Europe and vice versa. So I think that and that requires greater dissemination, more institutional exchanges, people working at the government level, etc., things that you've laid out. We'll come to that. So Carola, coming over to you, you're in Brussels, you're seeing this from the European side. You've heard some ideas put forth by colleagues here on what are areas of issues, areas of opportunities. Can we hear from you, please?
Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon. I will start by saying that I'm super happy to be here with you because I think it's high time that, as you said earlier, we have a conversation around how the EU and India can engage in particular to tackle the climate crisis. And I would really thank you very much for the report you've been producing and you're presenting today. I think it reflects also a bit the thinking that the Commission has been putting into the EU-India relationship. And I really appreciate the fact that you've put very concrete ideas and proposals in there. I would like also to thank you for starting the conversation and bringing a bit the perceptions on the two sides perspective, because it's true that we have these perceptions that now we have to overcome for all the reasons that you've mentioned, in particular the acceleration of the climate change and its impacts affecting Europe. As you know, we are the fastest warming region in the world, and also India, which is highly affected by climate change, but also because of the change in the geopolitics as well. So I think also from the events we've seen in the past year, we had the European Commission all together traveling to India to meet the government, to also kickstart a new relation and a new partnership. And we have the ongoing negotiations of the FTA. I think that the proposal that you're putting on the table very much reflects our own policy paper, that is the joint communication on the new strategic EU-India agenda that the Commission has just published, where we present our vision of how indeed we could create a shared prosperity, strengthen our security, because this is also about how we strengthen this aspect, and then how we help each other and work together to tackle the global challenges. And I think the first commitment we've taken at government level is really to raise this strategic partnership to a higher level and to work on these different levels that are the prosperity, security, and the global challenges. And they are interlinked, as you discussed already. So I don't want to enter too much into the policy document. You've all read it. I think there are 5 pillars where climate is in fact integrated and interacting first with the prosperity and the sustainability of our economic development. So you mentioned trade. I would like here to point at, like you suggested, the necessity to develop or strengthen our supply chains to support the green transition and advancing also the resilience. Then we have a pillar on technology and innovation that you discussed, and I look forward to learn more about, let's say, the digital solutions that India has been developing, and indeed how we could use that in areas that are difficult, like measurement of emissions, taxonomies, etc. I think it's a very important point. Then I mentioned security and defense. I think here we also have an agenda on climate and security. You mentioned migration, but then also water management. And then the connectivity and global issues. I think here it's important. I was in a seminar last week where we discussed how our ecosystems are interrelated. And then also maybe exploring how this interconnection meaning climate is affecting the EU and it's affecting India, but we also live, let's say, in interconnected ecosystems, how we can address that together. And then the enablers, of course, are like you were mentioning, the skills, promoting mutual understanding, involving business communities, stakeholders, etc. This is very important because when we talk about tackling climate change, it's not only an affair for governments. It's also we need to bring all this energy that we have among the stakeholders, and that's why I appreciate the discussion today, because we need the academics, but we need also the NGOs, we need also the cities, we need all this the population, because it's something we have to tackle together. Then, of course, we are not starting from zero. As you mentioned, we have already some partnerships, and in the climate and clean energy area, we have a dedicated partnership where we are developing activities, also the water partnership, the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So we have already this partnership, but the question now is how we take them to the next level to make sure that they deliver solutions. So I think the ideas presented in your paper are very interesting. My question that I bring to you is how we get there. And then you were asking the question, how many people in my team are working on India? I don't know if you invited also representatives of the Indian government, but it would have been nice to also have them around the table. But if you want to know, I have a team of 19 people managing bilateral relations with the whole world. So we have, I must say, the Asia team is the biggest one, with the neighborhood team, because we also cover enlargement accession negotiations. And now I'm considering to indeed increase the amount of work and of colleagues working on relations with India because of this now. Let's say, trying to take the strategic partnership to the next level. But it's less than 2 people, but the same from China. So because with a team of 19, we have to cover the whole world. But as I said, we are really interested into bringing more ideas, bringing more people. But my question is how to get there, how we engage with our counterparts in the Indian government, how they will now structure their diplomacy in view of, let's say, this new political commitment that we have with each other, and in view of the new geopolitics. So that's, I guess, the next step. And I put the question to you as well, so that we can progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. It's always good to have be the moderator, because the questions from the panelists can be very conveniently punted to the other panelists. But I think good points, and I think point well taken on the recent growing importance and understanding of India at the EU, and therefore a potential, and I think a part of the answer to your question lies there, in a sense that, well, the Europe at the EU level will start to build expertise, deep expertise on India, which is what is needed given the complex relationship, and hopefully vice versa in the same regard. But so we will now open up for a little discussion amongst the panelists. I have a few questions that I'll moderate our discussion for another 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A from everybody listening in. So I guess my question here is, Caroline laid out the pillars of the EU-India joint, the communique from the EU on what that partnership will look like. It's got supply chain resilience, it's got cooperation in other areas. On the Indian side, I have heard the things on top priority being finance, technology, investment, growth economy, don't have a neat access to markets potentially for low tech, regulations, sustainable finance regulations in Europe, have onshore capital in the EU. So given that there are all these existing forums that are already in place, Jochen touched on them, Caroline touched on them, where some of these things are being discussed. What is the prize here? Right? We've got all these existing forums. We're saying the FTA, there's political buy-in for. We're really looking at the international investment treaty, but the IPA. Okay? So, given what is this going to do, or what do we hope for this new thing to do that the existing forums and platforms are not doing, or are not touching on specifically for climate? So, would be great to get your thoughts on that and other responses that you have. Shruva, over to you first, then Jesse, then Caroline.
So, if I go back to your arranged marriage versus love marriage thing, I think what we need here is a little bit of chemistry to go with the physics, right? So, no matter how many forums you have and how many documents you have, what that spark has to be ignited, which takes a whole, let's say 2 billion people, right? We have to move 2 billion people on all these matters. So this is not the business of a forum or a document or any amount of that. What I think Jesse mentioned and I deeply agree with is that we've simply not had enough conversation beyond, let's say, the highest level of politicians speaking or diplomats doing backdoor things or indoor things that the public or even, let's say, track 1.5, track 2 people like us don't have access to. And this leads to two things, and it goes back to the point of trust, is that nothing is communicated to the public at large, so you do not get public buy-in for big ticket moves. And you have pockets of information, pockets of action that do not integrate across tracks. Because if you're saying finance, technology, this and that, these are silos in themselves. What do we have that is cutting horizontally across? So even if the EU document has 6 areas or 5 areas, are these areas talking to each other? There are different people handling different areas. So for example, I'm very rarely in rooms with actual DPI experts. We've started that in India, where we said that, all right, let's talk to the tech guys on how we can bring climate in. Now you're adding a layer to that where a foreign country has to do this between itself, which is a block of many countries, and then do that with us. So to me, there has to be active conversation beyond the politicians and the diplomats. That's round one. So channels have to be created. Academia is one. We also don't have enough academic exchange. We have a lot of students going there, but we don't have exchange of thought back and forth. We don't have exchange of views back and forth. This is in fact a very rare occasion where we are sitting at the same table talking on this thing, which is not a closed door thing. It's a public dissemination of thoughts. The second thing I want to talk about is the definition of prosperity. And I go back to, this is what you were saying, that you keep going back to prosperity, but it means different things to India and different things to India. And therein is that climate conversation, emissions, footprint, who's using what is considered the bare minimum. So I think even if we don't have this definition at a global level, going back to where Jesse says that we can maybe develop the global template for this. What would be an acceptable high quality of life that's aspirational enough, but low carbon? Austerity is not a conversation that can pick up in India at this point because we're going in for a development conversation. So this balance again, and this again goes back to communicating with the public and understanding their pulse. Otherwise, the political will cannot be generated. And we're seeing that already in Europe, where the political will is changing and different things are being demanded than they were about a decade ago. So that's the second point. And the third thing is is where all these taxonomies and regulations are all collide. And again, unfold, and this is where the FTA, for example, will become a critical point because people will start obsessing about some minor points. And it will be seen as a big fracas, whereas these are solvable items with the nitty-gritties. So we need to have two sets of conversations here. One, which is where you're discussing the codes and regulations and taxonomies, and you break it down, and it's negotiations after the COP negotiations are coming up. We're going there. India will say a set of negotiated points. They'll place it over there, which is very different from, let's say, the actions we're actually taking nationally or subnationally. So equating these things with negotiations points is, to my mind, not the route to build a relationship, let alone a partnership.
Jesse.
I think you're absolutely right about the public pulse. that's an area where you do a lot more thinking work than I do. I think work a lot with policymakers and with business stakeholders. And there I think we can start with a substantial, but perhaps not very long, short list from the long list of the things that we've been discussing at the working level. Few cities were mentioned. Look, heat resilience is becoming an issue, well, certainly in southern Europe, where my European home is, and here. And one of the elements that's developing in Europe is we are very quickly driving cars the streets of our cities. India is the world leader in electric 2- and 3-wheelers. That, I think, is the future of European city streets. Not least, we have many very narrow streets, and not everybody wants to walk all the time. I'm in the market for an electric 2- and 3-wheeler, and if an Indian model would like to appear in a shop in Italy, I'm there. Those vehicles would have to meet certain European standards. We've introduced a right to repair as part of our circular economy measures in Europe. There's been a lively discussion about the recycling of electric batteries, but that's only part of the circular economy. So we need clarity about which products could play into these growth markets. Another example, defense was mentioned. There are some dual and triple use technologies that are relevant for electricity grids, transport systems, defense technologies. Clearly, computer chips. Now, India is a leader in design, would like to do a lot more manufacturing. In Europe, our car sector is the world leader in control electronics. These two come together across all three sectors. Skills. Perhaps I won't name any companies, but I have certainly been into companies in Europe where I have met an enormous number of Indian technical experts working. And I have a lot of Indian students in Berlin. We have pushed very hard on smart grids in Europe, and we have smart grid developers who very much wish to move into emerging markets, where, of course, their big growth opportunities lie. There will be exchanges of skills, and we need to find ways to enable that. And there are ways to do that within trade and investment type negotiations, to which you don't necessarily have to attract a big banner that says migration. These is skills and work visas. Finance, Sangeet, I very much defer to you in the finance space, but where there is finance, the chances that you can build that around joint ventures and thereby achieve tech transfer is essentially the pattern we've seen around the world working to date. The really big numbers that were tossed around over the last few years are not going to appear magically overnight, but even some substantial, modest projects, perhaps sectoral, perhaps addressing particular hard-to-abate sectors, where there was room for joint funds that are earmarked for clear purposes, so there's a lot of trust on both sides, would be areas where I think we would start to see companies coming together, those tech transfers happening. And if I want to step back and do a very helicopter view here, thinking about the hard-to-abate sectors, India, very high emissions, primarily due to coal, both as fuel and in the power grid, but cheap power. Europe, rather lower emissions, but extremely expensive electric power. So there are reasons to look on both ends from the point of view of companies looking at next technological leaps. Work again forthcoming on more details for that sort of thing, and I don't want to take us down too much of a rabbit hole immediately. Just one last word here. I think it's very, very important that we recognise that the structure of Brussels and the structure of Delhi institutionally are not quite the same. There are, depending on how you count, 4 energy ministries here in the government of India, but once you start adding some sectoral ministries, you very rapidly reach a number more like 10. Yes. The division of mandates and remits between the EU and the member states, so also, frankly, some institutional mutual understanding is really very important and will be important to our business stakeholders, because on both continents and elsewhere in the world, I think a lot of businesses are now looking to policymakers to provide the coordination signal for the green transition. It's very difficult for me to change my innovation, investment, business structure unless I'm fairly confident that other actors in my value chain will be changing in the same direction on roughly the same timeline. Somebody has to coordinate. They look to policy to do this. But they're very mystified by policymakers too. Some of this is lawyers in policy departments and engineers and financiers in business. Some of it's simply not sat on the other side of the desk. Now we add the additional complexity of Europe and India. I think there's a lot of, in that discursive space, training, learning, and I would like to see many more exchanges. I had a delightful dinner last night with one of the people in India behind the historic, global, phenomenal success of the solar mission. And one of the themes of discussion was a pattern of just how many Chinese delegations were traveling around Europe over the last 20 years. I worked for the electricity sector in Brussels for a bit. We must have had a delegation a week. That should be happening in both directions between Europe and India, please. Starting yesterday.
Super. So I think Jessie has given us some action points, some things to think about. I turned to Caroline. She ended her first intervention with what should we be doing to make this happen? So what I'm hearing from our authors, there are some opportunities, there are pieces on finance, there is trust, they're part of the trust deficit. Dealing with the trust deficit is exchanges, but part of that is also action. Trust cannot be manufactured. There has to be evidence for trust to develop. And I think this is where I would maybe tie into a point that Jessie and Shubha both touched on, and then turn over to Caroline to say, when India says finance, investment, technology, there is an implicit understanding that the Commission can't make that happen. Right? The Commission can maybe make some public finance happen, but the volumes of that will be quite limited. That is the reality of the world that we're living in. I think there is an acknowledgement of that. That does not take away the responsibility of it, but the ask is for commercial capital at fair terms, yes, for opportunities. Creating the enabling environment for that, and bringing the respective parties within the EU member states, businesses, investors, that is an ask of the Commission. To say, can you create that enabling environment? And part of that, right, the ask back in kind of what is it that we can do that is slightly lower stakes to build the trust. And that is, I think, the first step in saying, this could potentially work. Is there a smaller model, a pilot model, what this could be that can be scaled? I think that is what I'm really hearing from both the co-authors.
Success breeds success.
Success breeds success.
Yes.
And the other bit, and I think this is the positive side of the trust, and I think the other bit would be, let's not make any faux pas in this. And I think it's easier said than done. A lot of this is, there has been an acknowledgement amongst colleagues that I have met in Europe that yes, India it is on a different timeline for legitimate reasons. So it should meet some different standards and different regulations. There is an in principle understanding, but the regulatory frameworks in Brussels are not always easy to maneuver for that same effect. So if there is something coming down the line in Brussels that was known in Brussels for 5 years or 10 years because it was the original design in Brussels, Brussels should not assume the rest of the world knows that, right? And this is a communication issue. you don't have a say in how this changes. This is law in EU, etc., and vice versa.
Mhm.
And so I think there are things of that nature that we should learn from. We are now here. There is an opportunity. There is political momentum, and there is, an arranged marriage really waiting to happen. So with that, yeah, I hope I've touched on some of the things that we could potentially be concretely doing and summarizing what our two authors have said for this. But curious to hear your thoughts on what they've said and whether you think this is possible and what you're seeing on the European side. Oh, Caroline.
Thank you. Yes, I will make maybe 3 remarks. First of all, at the beginning, you mentioned a bit how the politics is changing in Europe. I think that what we see, and you were mentioning the importance of getting people's view, that we did a Eurobarometer survey just before the summer, and more than 80% of the European citizens were expecting that we tackle climate change because they are living it, on a daily basis in any region in Europe. They see the direct impact of it. So that's, I think, an important element. So despite the conversations that people may feel that, okay, we are backtracking or the politicians are looking at other aspects, I think that's an important element that we have to take into account in the policy making. Of course, like you talked a lot about prosperity, about the economy, about technology, see how we reconcile these needs and create the opportunities for the people to be able to manage the risks, but also access a cheaper green technologies. And you were mentioning, for example, mobility solutions in cities. The second aspect you mentioned, we have to create the enabling factors for investment and commercial opportunities. I think this is the purpose of the FTA, because we are very well aware, you mentioned we can create a market of 2 billion people. And that I think it's very important, because under this FTA, it's not only about reducing customs duties on the goods, but it's also about create rules. And as you know, climate and environment have a dedicated chapter, how the trade can promote sustainable development. On this aspect, it's not a secret that we don't see quite eye to eye on what are the expectations and how we integrate climate challenges and climate policies into that space. And like I think one of you mentioned that, if I understood well, that it's true that sometimes the Indian negotiators propose texts that do not necessarily reflect the domestic policies. But I mean, I'm sure that we will overcome that. And as you know, for us, it's very important indeed that we also have this framework that allows give a sense of travel to our companies, that we continue with the transition, and then we work on the opportunities. And that's a very important aspect you mentioned. Once the FTA is concluded, once we have the framework, we have the rules, that then we make these opportunities happen. So then we will have to see how in practice what in practice we need to develop further than this framework to allow for the opportunities to happen. And when it comes to exchange, I think you mentioned the regulatory frameworks in the EU is not easy to navigate, to work with. There's a communication issue. I think here one aspect is that we are now we have increased our capacity to work with third countries on carbon pricing, on carbon markets, emission trading system. So we have created a task force in DG Clima with 10 people who have this knowledge of carbon pricing policies and how to create markets. And that's a task force, is diplomacy task force. And then we are also engaging with India, that is developing its first market, to help them to learn, let's say, from the EU experience that we have with ETS, and then share the good practices, but also the mistakes we've done, and then how we can accelerate the deployment of that market in India so that it really contributes to reducing the emissions So I don't know what will be the level of ambition in the nationally determined contribution of India, but for us it's very important that then you put in place the necessary policies to achieve these objectives of your NDC. And then we are deploying then the efforts of this task force, so where we can have many more exchanges on what is a purpose of a carbon market and how we develop it. And how it applies to then the different sectors that need to reduce their emissions. So that's one, let's say, a concrete, let's say, activity that we are developing on an important, or let's say, the core element of our climate policy. But then there are others that we are also happy to develop on other areas of climate. We were mentioning resilience, cities resilience. Now the EU will be joining the CHAMP. So we have, let's say, also some areas that we are looking at where we could also exchange, but also learn. In particular, you know that we are preparing now our European climate adaptation plan for next year, and that now we are gathering, let's say, good practices and good solutions from other parts of the world. So I think there as well, once we have also our action plan, that we can also engage on this topic and how we make our infrastructure more resilient to climate effects across the different parts of society and the economies. That's also an area that probably we can further discuss. And I take the point that should not be only government to government, but also involve the people. And I think we have a very, very vibrant network of European cities that are working together around different aspects of climate change, and that we can bring also to India.
Thanks, Caroline. I have a very quick follow-up question on this task force on the carbon pricing. I think it's a very good initiative. I think there has been a growing number of launching of carbon markets in third countries. You said that part of the task force is sharing lessons learned from the ETS for other markets. Will it also be looking at what is the ask of third country carbon markets for looking at compatibility, interfaces with the ETS as well? Or is it mostly talking about ETS learnings and etc.? So is there an opportunity there to bring together other forum to really discuss? Would be great to hear a little bit more on that.
Obviously, when you exchange lessons learned and then explain how a system works, then you have this issue of indeed when you will develop your system in the other country, what are the key features you have to look at? So, for example, you will need to have a cap to reduce the emissions. You will need to have a system of granting free allowances based on the benchmark. You know, we provide, let's say, the information on what your market needs to be a real financial market and bring the reductions. And then in that conversation, indeed, you will have questions from the other side on saying, okay, how can I put this in place considering how my industry and my economy is organized, my level of development. But that's where I think what is important is what you mentioned on the technology solutions we can bring. For example, for measuring the emissions. You know, so we have, for example, this train the trainers program with China. That with China we have 10 years of cooperation on ETS, and they are developing their ETS. Let's say trying to mirror the EU ETS. And then we have this conversation. So how the countries can catch up in order to, let's say, have a system that is effective and that is cost efficient. Then in terms of interoperability, that's what I was mentioning. Now, what are the key features you need in your ETS? This is a very difficult one because we have a 25-year system. It's a financial market. So this is the level where we have. And we know it took us so much years. So we know that the other countries as well will need. But then how can they catch up? They don't need to have all this time. And how can we use solutions to support the development of these markets. So it's let's say it's a conversation, and with each country the conversation is different, even if we have all these questions. Then it allows us to, from this conversation on carbon markets, to us in our team to then engage on conversations on how you handle the green transition, the transition from fossil fuels, so you can open even broader conversations on your energy systems, transport, etc. Together with my colleagues in DG Energy. Because when I mentioned earlier, I have a small team, but then it's without counting all the colleagues in the Commission who have also an international department and works on relations with India. So I think we have quite a critical mass of people that can really do things in this partnership.
Super. Thank you, Caroline. So we've got some questions that have come in. Devika, is it okay if we move to the audience Q&A?
Yes, Shashank, please go ahead.
Super. So I'll get the questions out, and then any of the panelists can take them. I think there's a first question on emerging technologies, innovations in the climate tech, startups, basically, in the climate tech innovation space. There have been quite a lot of them in India. There is a question, essentially, if I interpret it correctly, is there have been partnerships that some of these companies have had with individual EU countries. What can be done more at the EU level to enable greater collaboration, open up the markets in the climate tech innovation space? Who wants to take it? Shiva, Jesse?
I'll hold on that one. It's a great question because we're asking ourselves this question within the European Union at the moment. We are a single market, but we are not perfectly a single market across all arrangements. And there are lots of asks from our own startup sector to create more coherence at continental scale within the European Union bloc. That is now an urgent project and is happening. The question is, are we going to do that behind a buy European, support European only barrier, or are we also going to think about opening up, particularly, let's say, lead markets for green tech, to other actors in the world, if they can bring in as good as better green techs? I think the case for partnership, for technology results, for climate results, for justice results, for overall economic and trade results is very, very strong. This is the moment to have that conversation coming from the Indian side as a question posed to Europeans. And we'll ask ourselves that a little bit, but India can certainly ask it in louder terms. It's a good moment. So that's not a here's how we do it, it's a come and sit at the table in this conversation kind of answer.
Super. Caroline, we know you have to head off, so we've got one or two questions from the audience for you, so we'll send them your way first. We've got a question which brings up something you said on China and the 10-year cooperation that you had on the ETS. The question is, you've seen India and China up close in climate negotiations, in your discussions on finance and technology. What are the differences you've noticed on cooperation with India versus China from the EU perspective? Do you see divergences? And what, if there are any, learnings that could be brought to this nascent engagement in the climate space for the EU and India?
Welcome to straight speaking. That's a very straight question.
Well, I think the history of the relations on climate policy between the EU and China and EU-India, I mean, the difference in the depth and the length of this cooperation is very clear. I think the difference is that, as you know, China now has taken, let's say, considers the green transition as its economic development model. They have invested heavily in the transition, and they also realize very early what the impacts of climate change are on the country. And China is investing very much in water management, in reducing emissions, in adaptation, I think. So that's, let's say, a sort of approach to climate policies that is maybe started earlier in China, and that has created this opportunity for us to work together on these matters. And as I mentioned, we have a long cooperation on emission trading system. I see that now at this moment there is this Shanghai conference on carbon markets, where my director general is attending, and we have a policy dialogue on ETS also that meets every year. And we have the high-level dialogue also at the level of our vice president and the Chinese vice premier every year on climate and environment and energy. So I think this is a quite established cooperation. And now when we discuss taking the strategic partnership with India to the next level, that's really our idea, to also enhance the cooperation and the conversation with India on these topics. And here, as you all mentioned, one opportunity is to look at the economic opportunities we can create. But then for me, it's important as well that we keep the space on climate policy as well, looking at the two, in parallel. So we hope that this offer that we made in our communication will be taken up by the Indian government, and that we can further strengthen with those policy dialogues, where we can also address difficult issues. We discuss CBAM with all the countries with which we engage. We had a lot of seminars with companies in different countries to prepare for CBAM. But you need to have some sort of open dialogue and this regular structured conversation so you can put in place more specific activities. So I'm looking forward to further developing these climate policy conversations and with Indian authorities.
Super. Just following on that, there's another question, Caroline, also for you and then Jesse. How do you see the new strategic EU-India agenda contributing to industrial decarbonization, especially in the steel sector? So
I think that we've been discussing it all through this hour together. I think indeed our communication is the basis, or our offer for us for the strategic partnership, and then that we can look at concretely. You were mentioning how to address how to abate sectors, how we can green and decarbonize the industry. That's a top priority for Europe. So that will certainly feature high in our cooperation with India and in the strategic agenda. But I invite the participants to look at the communication of the Commission of the 17th of September, where you will see the ideas are quite detailed also on this part.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Caroline. Much appreciated.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for this very open and stimulating conversation. And I look forward to continue this conversation with you. And please continue to feed us and feed the debate with your ideas and contributions and encouragements. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline. We have a few questions for the other panelists as well. There's one question on adaptation that I think, Shubha, you kind of touched on this. Much of the question goes, much of the dialogue focuses on mitigation, not adaptation, but adaptation is quite clearly equally urgent. How do you see adaptation being integrated into the strategic partnership?
So, one thing that I sort of got from Caroline, and she's gone over here, is that in Europe, the conversation on economy and climate are different tracks. Now, India has come into this development trajectory at the height of the climate crisis. So everything we do has the adaptation entity built in, because we really cannot be mitigating at this point. It's too late for all of them. Like to take one approach over here. So, for example, anything India does, and I'll actually address the steel question.
Please, yes.
Because what happens is when we say hard to abate industry or sector, we are not breaking it down into its component parts. And there's many. So at CEW, for example, we have something called the string of pearls design, where we map every single node of that sector. And each has its own value and supply chain that needs to be greened, right? And when we say what's green steel, what is green steel? So I go back to the definitions, and that is where you get stuck in the regulation. Because some component somewhere is not green, also goes to dual use and all of those things, ball bearings and diodes and all that stuff. But in terms of adaptation, for example, we are now doing a lot of nexus work, and we are in India, on water, food systems, the nutrition systems, the heat over there, and the climate risks overall, which is floods, droughts, cyclones, etc. All of them are happening higher. The Himalayan region has different challenges than our coastal regions, than the central Gangetic basins. So Indian policy, I would say, is now through the efforts of the government have started becoming integrated. So any policy has multiple ministries feeding into them. So there would be a nodal ministry, but they keep convening the Council of Ministers or the Council of Secretaries or the Council of States because they have big says in this. So adaptation is something for us that is, I would say, built into every single policy that's coming up. We are now, CW, in fact, is doing 300 heat maps for 300 cities and towns. So it's that pervasive a thought process that even at the local body level or the district level or the panchayat level, they're aware of these things, which is not really the mitigation. Mitigation, everybody understands, you got to use less one. But this is built in because we have come into this at a very, very dangerous moment.
I'm just, in the interest of time, going to get to the other some of the other questions, and maybe you could both comment on them. One is on investment, as clearly we've been talking about it, is a central economic outcome kind of sought out of this partnership. What should businesses and investors be contributing and shaping to these initiatives? So I think this is a very good question and an important voice that really needs to be kind of in the room. So how? That's for you. And I think, Jesse, you've done some work on safeguards to support structures to ensure effects on SMEs and maybe MSMEs, because some of the SMEs and some of these sectors are quite large and their effects from carbon taxes. So do you want to go first and then Shubham?
I'm going to allow myself one sentence on adaptation.
Yes.
We've seen the importance of the price of eggs in a major global election last year. The price of rice, the price of bread, essentially food security is, if you want to summarize climate and adaptation in 2 words, this is what we all need to be looking at, because that's the consequence of the disruption to weather systems and water systems. Okay, were there to be a Indian, European joint clean tech business platform created by leaders across different sectors, leaders within their sectors, who very much wish to be at the front edge, and who came together to lobby both sets of decision makers, that could be an extraordinarily powerful voice. You ask what to do, the recommendation is organize and engage in both jurisdictions jointly. Now, it's hard work to come up with those joint positions, but then that's the work that the businesses are better qualified to do than many of the policymakers. And that means that if you can get there, do some joint positions, you will be listened to with great seriousness. I put parts of my working life into that space, so I do understand the depth of the challenge. Quick remark on the EU agenda document that was published earlier this week, last week. It's been so busy here, I've slightly lost track of time. That document was obviously not published without considerable sharing, consultation, and listening to the Indian partners. Quick remark on steel. Something you and I think, have coming out shortly. Strong recommendation to anybody interested in this space. Don't just focus on the CBAM. Read the EU's steel and metal sector plan. The EU has a comprehensive set of discussions and visions on the future of its very challenged steel sector. And I think this is at the moment very much an intra-European vision about how we address the CapEx, the OpEx challenges of the green steel premium. But it's early stage, and there is still room for that to become part of a more bilateral and a more global conversation. I'm not going to go into depth in CBAM. I have a publication coming out very shortly looking at a number of the ways where there are pragmatic arrangements that could be made, perhaps, around the impact on smaller actors. I'm not worried about the CBAM and India's leading steel companies. They are as competent, if not more competent, as others around the world. But some of the SMEs, the MSMEs, do face enormous compliance challenges. And over time, because the tariff is phasing in over time to 2030, tariff challenges. And I think we really need to think about these in the context of justice. And also because we have phased in many of our green standards within Europe for our own smaller actors. So why shouldn't we offer some phasing in and some transitional arrangements and some help internationally in the same way? Quick word on just transitions. I think when we talk about finance, we mean certainly primarily private sector flows. This is where the big long zeros on the end of the number come from. Some of that will be mobilized by concessional public finance, and there will be some grant money. And it seems to me very clear that one of the things that should be coming as an ask from the Indian side is the focusing of that grant money on parts of India where the just transition is most challenging, which are often not the parts of India where the commercial money is going to be looking to go. Now, those are not judgments that should be made in Brussels. Those are judgments that need to come from Delhi and the state governments in India as propositions to Brussels, Berlin, Paris, etc. I'll wrap up that by saying that there is, throughout this conversation, an emphasis on more dialogue, but also on both sides doing a lot more homework. And that's perhaps one of the pieces of homework that would be on India's desk. And the more detailed that proposal, the more traction it will have with our Putin colleagues who do like their detailed documents. I'll stop there.
Super, thanks, Jessie. So, sure, unless you have something else you want to come in on, I'll otherwise wrap us up.
That's fine. I just have one sentence to say because I just feel globally the conversations are becoming narrower and narrower. Right? We are being pushed into very narrow baskets of countries engaging with each other. I think for EU especially, right now there are a lot of pressure to conform. And it's important from a confidence building point of view that EU resists that pressure to get boxed into a certain area by itself. Right? And I think that would play a very large role in India expanding its relationship with EU as EU itself and not a part of the Western or Global North bloc.
May I add one last sentence?
Please.
The famous slogan, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
Questions that I've been asked at the beginning of last week, the beginning of the week before, the beginning of the week after that. Every now and then there is a panic. A lot of them are caused by third actors impacting this discussion. But it's very clear that the EU is not going to sacrifice its growing relationship with India to external pressures from anyone. That was a question last week. I think that question has disappeared this week. Let's not get too lost in the noise of the headlines.
Yeah.
Let's really focus on a menu, on deliverables, on a steady set of arrangements and a marriage that will last.
Super. So now I have the opportunity to give some closing remarks and maybe have some takeaways from this very both specific in some instances discussion, but also far-reaching, right, in a way of the coverage of sectors and the types of issues that have been discussed by our two co-authors and Caroline, who was with us online. If I was to just look at this and kind of link this to some of the comments Jochen made at the very beginning, right? There is this the promise, the potential of this partnership has always been there. It is now more relevant than ever. It is more relevant than ever, particularly for climate, which I think stands, which if the last hour did not convince you, I don't know what else will. But it clearly needs, and I will go back to my analogy, a lot of joint family to do the arranging. So for my European colleagues, arranged marriages happen, and it's a big family affair, and distant cousins and relatives are involved, people you've never heard of before. And that is what is really needed in this. So when Caroline asked and said, what is it that we do? What are the next steps? What is our homework? I would say I would break it into 2 or 3 categories. One, I think we need more of these. So I think it's great that the Heinrich Böll Stiftung is taking the initiative on this, but I think we need to get more specific. So there has been a menu that has been outlined in this brief. Let us have one on each of those. Let us get the people who are actually thinking about those sectors, talking about what are their issues, what are the opportunities there. Unless we have that, we don't know what the size of the pie is. So I would say that's one. What is on the menu? Let's discuss which of those things on the menu are really on the menu and are not. So we can get out from the long list to the short list. So I think that's 1. 2 is we need a better understanding of each other's institutions. And I think this is kind of becoming clear. We're saying we're recognizing each other, institutions move slow. So let's see what we can do to help that, whether that's bilateral engagement, whether that's delegations, government, business, together, etc. And 3, that we need more creative solutions. These we have standards there, standards here, they can't match, there's constraints. What are some of the creative solutions around finding compromises for that? And for that, we need research, we need academia to take this partnership, particularly on some of these standards, climate pieces more seriously. So I would say, buckets of homework for us to really think about in this context and from this discussion. So thank you all. I will turn over to Devika and Jochen for closing us out.
Thank you, Sangeet. I want to thank our panelists and attendees for joining us today and to the attendees for your questions. I think it has been an incredibly comprehensive conversation. We've had a diversity of views from academia, track 1.5, track 1 even. And needless to say, green transition continues to be a central node of the EU-India strategic partnership. And despite the external disruptions, hopefully looks set to drive the relationship forward. CSDR and HPS will be back soon with the last webinar of the series soon. We hope you will join us again as we circle in on all the major issues and topics in the EU-India partnership ahead of the summit, hopefully in early 2026. There is a lot of exciting things coming up, I'm sure. We just saw this new strategic agenda, and hopefully we'll see more with the summit. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you have a very, very good day, and thank you.
Thank you all.